Well, we typically tell students that your college essay is your face to the admissions committee, right? So this is really one of the only times when they get to find out more about you as a person beyond just a simple list of your courses, your test scores, and your grades and your activities. So the essay is really the only time that you can really truly shape the narrative, quite literally in this case, right? So many students, however, struggle with this process because let's face it, it's kind of a very unnatural thing for students to write in a very personal and reflective way because this is oftentimes something you don't do in college or in high school, right? So most of the time, high school essays tend to be much more analytical or argumentative in nature. So it's a very, very different experience. It's definitely something that many high schoolers do not have experience doing. So what colleges want to see in this type of an essay is really not necessarily as a writing sample of what you're going to do in terms of actual college essays, which, to be honest, tend to be a little bit more like your high school essays. But there is this opportunity for them to find out more about you as a person, right? Because college admissions people cannot go out there and interview every single applicant themselves. Yes, a college interview exists for many colleges, but that's more indirect, right? So what the colleges see in the essays is that this is their chance to sort of get to know a little bit about you through your writing, right? So you want to be able to convey certain things about who you are, what your values and what your motivations are so that they can see a little bit more whether or not you fit the type of community that they're trying to form. Okay, so in terms of the actual topics, so the common application, which is the main sort of general universal application that people use for applying to private universities and quite a few public universities as well, there's a range of topics that you can select from. Now, these tend to be very broad and varied. You will have things about your background and identity, an obstacle that you faced, or a belief that you challenged, for instance. There's like 7 whole prompts to pick from, but in truth, many admissions people that I've talked to don't even really look at which prompt they picked. They just dive right into the story because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day which topic you picked. There's no wrong or right topic to pick. I think it's much more important for you to just go ahead and maybe use these as a rough guideline to see what might be possible. But in fact, it's probably better for you not to feel sort of pigeonholed by these prompts in a way, right? So I don't want you to feel like these have to be the only things you can write about. And in fact, if you look at the wording of some of the prompts, they are designed to be pretty broad. Like the first one theoretically can fit any college application, right? So if you're talking about a background, identity, interest, or talent, and it says like, please share your story, honestly, any personal statement can be made to fit that prompt. Now, if you still feel like that doesn't fit, there's also prompt 7, which is simply to share an essay of any topic of your choice. So if you're able to share on any topic, then yeah, you can literally write on just about any topic you want. So don't feel constrained by these. These are here as a general rule of thumb guidelines for you. They're not meant to necessarily limit what you can say in the personal statement. And I think that's really important. Okay. Next is, so how important are these essays in the admissions process? Well, long story short, they're very important, right? So this is the most recent survey of NACAC. So the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, they meet every single year, and this is the most recent survey for fall 2023 of the different factors that colleges consider in the application process. And unsurprisingly, of course, your grades, your academic record is by far the single most important thing. And you could see that across the board, that's definitely one of the biggest factors for any college, right? The vast majority of colleges will consider it the most important, right? But just below things like your high school courses and the curriculum will be things like your positive character attributes, which they can tell through different ways. Of course, the essays being a big part of that, but things like your recommendations, your interview can be part of like finding out who you are as a person. The essay writing sample is then immediately below that. But if you really think about what your essay also shows, it does actually also show your positive character attributes. So in a sense, you can kind of view that as like a combination there, right? They're really kind of one and the same because the essay should be the biggest part for them to be able to see who you are as a person and what your positive character attributes should be. Okay. So in a way, these are probably the single most important factor beyond your grades and your academic record, right? So they're a way to see all the other different elements in your application in terms of your motivation. They are also indirectly a way for you to share things about things like your extracurricular activities. So in a lot of ways, this tends to be that powerful wild card that basically shapes who might get into a college. And I think this becomes even more important the more selective a college is, because in truth, if you're applying to, let's say, an Ivy League level school, right? So I would venture to say that most, if not, well, I guess, yeah, most serious candidates to the school will probably have straight A's or very close to like a perfect GPA. If they are going to be submitting test scores, it'll probably be really, really close to like a perfect 1600 or a perfect 36 on the ACT, right? So at some point, there's only so many different factors left over that can serve as crucial tiebreakers to distinguish one applicant from the other. And of course, obviously the activities are going to be a big part of it, but just as important or even more important potentially is what you say about yourself, okay? The essays, a great essay gives you that advantage or that opportunity to transcend potential weaknesses in your application, right? So let's say you don't necessarily have a perfect GPA, maybe you have a B or two. You could still potentially be competitive for a top school if you write a very amazing essay, a compelling essay that showcases just how wonderful you are as a potential addition to their college community, right? And I think that's exactly why the essays are such an important part of the process, because they allow you to go ahead and sometimes leapfrog some people who may be, at least on paper, slightly more qualified a candidate, right? And so a great essay can do wonders. Now, of course, it can't solve everything. So let's face it, like if you're a B and C student, even if you write the most amazing essay in the world, it's probably not going to get you a serious consideration among, let's say, Ivy League schools, okay? But it still allows you to go ahead and overshoot your potential, right? So if, let's say, for example, based on your grades, you're like, people are saying that, oh, you're only competitive for this school or that school. We've seen many amazing success stories at HS2 in which students are able to go above and beyond what people thought they were capable of doing, right? Getting into some, really great colleges that people thought, oh, that's impossible. You can't possibly get into that school, right? But with essays that really highlight the right qualities or attributes and show that you're a good fit for the college, you can do amazing things with some very good essays. Okay, so how are these essays evaluated? Okay, what does the process look like? Well, I mean, fortunately, I can certainly attest to this process a little bit because I do have first-hand experience. When I was in grad school at Harvard, I worked at the grad school admissions office as part of my internship. So I got to read PhD applications. So I know a little bit about what goes on in an admissions office in terms of how many essays you got to read or applications you have to read. I know sometimes you're not exactly always 100% focused on certain things. Sometimes you just have too many, applications to read, and it becomes sometimes difficult to retain the same amount of focus, right? That's also why I guess it's really important to have very compelling, interesting essays, because you have no control over like how many essays the person would have read before they got to your application. Okay, so typically, this is how the process works. For many competitive private schools, there'll be a committee process by which there's a first read process, right? You'll have two regional admissions officers who are more familiar with the general area that you're from. So let's say you're coming from Northern California, right? So there's going to be an admissions person who is more or less in charge of like the South Bay region or like, the East Bay area, right? They're more familiar with the high schools there. They will do a first read, okay? And they'll be paired up with another person who's familiar with the region, and they will each read theirs independently. In some cases, they might do what's called a team read, where they read it, they have two admissions people who read it, and then together, and they'll talk about the application as they read through them, right? Either way, though, it's typically the range that I've heard is that it's about 10 to 20 minutes per file, right? So they go by these things really quickly. So they're not going to sit down there and scrutinize every single little word for like an hour, which is what some students do. And so they sometimes think that every single word is like, oh no, I need to tweak this and change it. They don't scrutinize it that closely, unfortunately. So I think it's important that you're looking at the big picture, the overall takeaway from your essay as far more important, okay? each little tweak that you do may not necessarily have that much impact or any at all, to be honest. Okay. But if you have a good topic, you write in a style that's engaging, that's the most important thing. Now, you also, like I said, don't have any control over how many or what sequence you are or where you are in the order of things when they read your essay, right? So typically, what I've heard is that they tend to read about like anywhere between 40 to 50 files per day. So that's kind of crazy if you think about it. They have like really long days as well, because if you're averaging maybe about like 15 minutes per essay, if you're reading 50, that's like a 12-hour day, right? You're really logging in some serious overtime at this point. But then again, that's kind of part of the normal ebb and flow of an application cycle, right? They are going to have to go through very long hours to get through all the different applications. Okay. So the admissions officers then will read your essay to get a sense of who you are as a person, right? So indirectly, though, the quality of your writing can also be viewed as like a writing sample, right? So if you are a very good writer, very polished, very articulate, and you basically can convey thoughts in a very polished and clear way, that's a good sign, because then they think that you can do the same thing for your college classes, right? But on the other hand, essays don't need to be perfect, right? You don't need to hire a professional essay editor to go through every single little aspect, or like, a professional writer or anything like that, right? So it's more important that you have someone who knows what admissions people look for, right? So like sometimes people who are like professional writers may not always necessarily make the best college counselors, because they may know the writing aspect, but they may not necessarily know the actual college admissions process of what the admissions people want, right? The psychology behind writing essays. So ideally, you want to work with someone who can help you write your essays well, right? But also have that vantage point or that experience of knowing what it takes in the admissions process and what admissions people respond to. Okay. So even if your essays aren't like technically perfect in terms of every single grammatical aspect or in terms of like flow and vocabulary, it's fine, because sometimes essays that are too polished might also arouse the suspicion of some admissions people, because they might feel like it's not the student's original work, right? So sometimes it's okay to have those little tiny wrinkles to remind admissions people that this is in fact still the work of a teenager. Okay. Next, to just a little bit more of a sense in that committee system that I was mentioning earlier. So the normal sequence would be there's a phase one in which the first readers will read through the applicant process, and they'll give an initial reading of like likely, unlikely, strong interest, or high priority. Okay. There's also phase two. And this is the one we mentioned earlier, in which there's two regional admissions officers who will then evaluate the file and rank candidates on certain scales, right? So we're using Princeton here as an example, but I think most Ivies will probably have a fairly similar system. Students who make the cut here are then forwarded to I guess the semi-final committee meeting is the next step here typically, right? They will then go ahead and meet in a final committee meeting to make those really kind of tough cuts for the last few remaining spaces, right? At that point, they will then decide whether or not to admit or defer the student if it's early action, or waitlist the student if it's regular decision.